website. Um, you've already been reminded, please do keep your cameras off because it improves the broadband for everybody. And do keep yourself mute. And please do put any comments that you have or chat questions in the chat room, and you'll find the button for that at the bottom of your screen. Okay, so now I'd like to give a very warm welcome and introduction to our speakers. First of all, Kevin Nelson, who is Unison Regional Secretary for the Northwest and a member of the Communist Party. And Kevin is actually going to compare the discussion between the three authors of the book. So we have Keith Ewing from King's College London, we have John Maloney from the University of Southampton, and we have Andrew Moretta from University of Liverpool. So without more ado, a very warm welcome indeed to you all, and over to you, Kevin.
Thanks, Marge. There'll be four parts to this session. Firstly, we'll discuss the background to the book. Then we'll look at its findings and conclusions. Then its contemporary relevance with the current undercover police inquiry and the Covert Human Intelligence Sources Bill. And then we'll discuss what next with the authors. The book MI5, Cold War and the Rule of Law was published earlier this year. And I'd like to congratulate Andrew, Joan and Keith on this tremendous addition to a growing genre of histories of the British Secret Services and its leading personnel. Of course, this book is very different than the approach it takes, it being a forensic examination of the powers, activities and accountability in the post-war period of the security services, 1945 to 1964. It was the height of the Cold War, an era of political and military tension and of rampant anti-communism in the British establishment. And my first question is to Joan. Can you explain the background to the book, Joan, and how it evolved from an initial study of civil liberties in the Cold War?
Yeah, thank you. I did my graduate work at Cambridge a number of years ago. Keith Ewing was my supervisor there. And I wanted to look at the impact of the Cold War on civil liberties in Britain, because having grown up in the United States during that period and having seen how, appallingly badly the left was treated there, I had been raised to think that everything was just swell in Britain. This was a wonderful place to be if you were a member of the Communist Party, among other things. And so I went to see if that was really true. And I started my work at the time when the 30-year rule had just allowed the beginning of the files from that period to be open. So I got the first look at them. But as Keith and Andrew will tell you, a great deal more became open later on after I had concluded the first sort of run through. But between that and the archives of the National Council on Civil Liberties, as it then was, and other writings of people at the time, some interviews with some of the people who'd been active at the time, I put together, as I say, a general study of the civil liberties. And then it went on from there. So let me turn it over to my co-authors to carry on the exploration.
Okay. Yeah, so the idea, I think Joan and I got together probably about 10 years ago, maybe longer. We were going to revisit the civil liberties aspects of the Cold War. I mean, there's a lot going on in that period. And we thought, well, we would go and have a look, see what was available at Kew now that stuff had been released. A colleague of mine, Conor Gearty, and I had looked at the period between the wars, where there's a lot of stuff against the party. On 2 occasions, party leaders were jailed for sedition. A lot of the stuff, Communist Party archival material had been seized by the state and never returned. on a number of occasions. And that stuff, when we were looking at this way back, I mean, that was about 20 years ago, Connor and I were looking at this, the stuff was still, it was in the archive, but it hadn't been released. Now, when we went back in 2010 to look at the Cold War stuff, I mean, there was just a mountain of material which was now available to us. And in a sense, it was actually quite difficult to use. There's two problems with the data. I mean, one is that they don't, in a sense, there is too much release, but on the other hand, there's not enough release. So what they release is basically the state will release information so that historians can tell the history or write the history that the state would like to be written about in the Cold War period. So in a sense, you're only getting a very selective snapshot of what's actually there. And even the files that do get released or put into the public domain, a lot of these files are heavily redacted, or at least the documents in the files are redacted. A lot of documents in the files are simply removed and are withheld. So in a sense, you know, you're not getting a complete picture, but on the other hand, there is nevertheless, there is just a mountain of material. In a sense, like going into a big warehouse and just knowing where to start. So it does take a bit of effort just to get confidence with the material, to work your way through the files. Now, as at this point, I think that Andrew arrived on the scene, I think about 2 years later, in 2012, I think, Andrew. And in a sense, Andrew actually had this fantastic capacity to look at these files, to see things in the files that nobody else could see, to synthesize the file, to understand them. And really through his work, it became clear that this project, looking at civil liberties in one volume, was just impossible because there was too much material. So the starting point, I think, was to look at the agency that was responsible on behalf of the state, which was ultimately MI5. And there was a lot of stuff available about MI5, which had been released through these files, including in particular files about individual members of the Communist Party during this period. So in a sense, I mean, quite a few people now have been down there and worked on this stuff, but I think what we would claim we were doing is asking different questions from the questions that some journalists are asking, questions that historians of the intelligence services are asking. So in a sense, I think lawyers do bring they ask different questions and are looking for different answers. And I think that's what we've tried to do. But actually, I think a lot of the work that was done by Andrew and actually just digging into the material and getting under the skin of the material, finding stuff there that, as I say, certainly I would have missed if I'd been doing it on my own.
Thanks, Keith. Andrew, could you explain the sources, please? And picking up on Keith's point, the extent to which censorship endures over 50 years later, let alone 30 years from that period in question.
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, speak up a bit.
Okay, right. Okay, well, it started off really for me when Keith and I went to the NCCL archive at Hull. And we went up there with a sort of bit of bio and a pad of paper. And there was lots of interesting stuff up there. And then subsequently, I went down to Kew to look for information relating to the Public Order Act 1936 and the bans on marches around that time. I didn't actually find the relevant material until about two years later. But in the meantime, I was going down there constantly and I found loads and loads of really very, very interesting material. In fact, thinking about it in the last couple of days, I recall sitting there reading a file about Roger Hollis, you know, the famous Director General of MI5, before he was Director General, being sent to Australia to help them with their ailing security and intelligence organisation. And to my surprise, it seemed that before the Maxwell 5 directive had been issued in the United Kingdom, that they were issuing the Maxwell 5 directive in Australia, or at least aspects of the Maxwell 5 directive. And this was a complete mystery. But I subsequently came across certain Cabinet Office files which revealed the Attlee Directive, which had been released as a result of a public, result of a freedom of information request by a man called Daniel Lomas. He put in a freedom of information request in about 2005, about the time that under New Labour that there was a kind of new era of transparency, and they'd released the Stewart Report, which was one of the key early documents in the book. Now, the Attlee Directive could be found in some of the material that was released with the Stewart Report, which was really a groundbreaking thing, because one of the major steps taken by us in this book was the discovery that the Attlee Directive was the precursor of the Maxwell 5 Directive, that the Maxwell 5 Directive was not the beacon of civil liberties that it was made out to be. It was, in fact, a diluted version of an earlier, stricter document. That was one of the key findings, one of the early key findings. But we do have to tip our hat to Daniel Lomas for actually provoking the government to unearth it. I don't think that there's going to be a release of MI5 material on the scale that there was in that period of from about 2001 to 2015, perhaps, because I think they've learned their lessons, and I think looking at some of the stuff that they've put up on their website, there's been a certain reaction to the book. I'm not sure, I might be flattering ourselves, but I don't think so. I think that there's going to be a return to the position that you've got with the special branch. Special branch files down at Kew are very, very few and far between. There's a few very interesting historical volumes like George Orwell's, Eric Blair's special branch files, or Ronald Kidd, one of the founders of the National Council for Civil Liberties, but there's scarcely anything there. There was a man called Solomon Hughes who writes the Morning Star, who put in a freedom of information request in 2001, and as a result, we got a load of material relating to Wapping and to Grunwick, but that was it really. After that, they saw the error of their ways, and Special Branch have thereafter steadfastly refused to release the files. So I think we sort of hit it at about the right time. There's still a lot of very, very good material down there. And also we have the Little Diaries as well, which is an absolutely brilliant archive. And there's something else that occurred during the last couple of days I remembered to do with the Little Diaries, and they've been available to everybody absolutely free for the last few years. But I remember one Sunday morning looking at the front page of the Observer, and it said that painstaking research had revealed a diplomatic spy called David Floyd. And this was the front page of the Observer. And I knew that David Floyd was a spy because I read it in the Little Diary. And I was appalled. Obviously, what a trick to miss. Sunday morning, it's on the cover of the, but it shows you what you can find. Of course, I'd made the mistake of looking at it and assuming that everybody had read the bloody Little Diary. But of course they hadn't, and it was news. So anyway, as you can tell, there's a lot of pleasure to be had digging around at the National Archives, and there's a lot of pleasure to be had from reading the Little Diary.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. I understand, Keith, that your book has been reviewed in the German conservative press.
Has, yeah, I think so. Well, it's been very well reviewed in the Morning Star, I believe, Kevin, for which many thanks. But it is quite early. Yes, it's not that long published, but it was reviewed in the one of the German newspaper, equivalent to one of our broadsheets. I get the impression it's, would you say it's a conservative-leaning paper. It was reviewed by a professor of constitutional law, I think, in Germany. I think he referred to it as agitation. And basically he doubted. I mean, I just it's quite remarkable that somebody could so easily claim that MI5 had the legal authority, which we claim they did not have, and which we've spent 10 or 12 years looking to find unsuccessfully, unable to find the legal authority for much that went on. But this guy, nevertheless, I think in about 300 words, was able to dismiss the book as agitation and to say, of course, MI5 had the power, which it has always claimed to have. But I mean, in fact, the fact is that a lot of what MI5 and the other intelligence agencies were doing, I mean, it clearly didn't have legal authority. And I mean, that was identified in the 1980s and then again in the 1970s and then again in the 1980s by the European Commission on Human Rights and then subsequent and also previously by the European Court of Human Rights. So there's no question in my mind that MI5 was set up with doubtful legal authority, operating with doubtful legal methods and using data with doubtful, again, with no legal authority for the way in which the material was used or shared with other intelligence agencies. So, but I mean, they claim that they had, I think the claim of some people is that they had authority under the royal prerogative to establish an agency like this and to empower the agency. But if you go through all the legal texts on the royal prerogative, there's nothing that would authorize this sort of activity. And they claimed that what they did, in a sense, would be telephone tapping or burgling or breaking into people's homes or whatever, following people. This was claimed also to be either not unlawful or, if unlawful, to be covered by the prerogative. But again, there is no authority to support these conclusions. So my sense, our view, I think, the view taken in the book was that MI5, it didn't just operate in a twilight zone, but it operated also in a legal twilight zone until probably 1989.
Yeah, but that just reminded me of one really excellent source is the official MI5 history by Christopher Andrew. It's a great read, but inevitably it leans towards excusing MI5. And it was Christopher Andrews' book that said that they felt that much of their unlawful activity was actually permissible because of royal prerogative. But as I remember Keith saying at the time, it's pure Entick and Carrington to for the state to break into somebody's house to find out something that they want to find out about, and there's no question that it's unlawful. It's not defending the state. That's just taking things too far down the line. We can't without.
Is Andrew frozen there? So
I think so.
I think so. If you just
let me
just
pick up on that.
I was just going to say, Keith,
yeah.
In the book, you comment that MI5 had been over concerned with dissidents and not enough with spies.
Yeah. And
there was some very high profile, if not infamous, counter-espionage failures in this era. Would you like to comment on that point?
Well, if you go just look at the history of the post-war era, there were a number of spy scandals, alleged scandals, a number of prosecutions and convictions. And if you just go through, I mean, there's about 11 actually from 1945 through to about 63. There was one involving a guy called Alan Nunn-May, Klaus Fuchs, there's Bruno Ponteverco, there was a woman called Burton, who was a very famous spy who slipped away before she was caught. There was Burgess, McLean, and Philby. We've got Blake. You've got the Portland Down affair in the early 1960s, a guy called Christopher Vassell, and then the whole all the issues around the Profumo affair. Now, these were the major scandals at the time. And in the sense that this was the sort of stuff that MI5 had been set up to stop. But in each of these cases, the individuals in question had been able to get material and to ship it out or to share it with whoever had asked them to provide it. And what was compelling, I think, about the period is that despite the amount of effort and resources that went into counter espionage and counter subversion, there was no. What happened, I think, was that MI5 found the counter espionage aspects of their mandate to be basically too difficult. And a lot of the work as a result went into counter subversion. And basically counter subversion, they interpreted to mean basically targeting the Communist Party members, people on the left. And basically that net got wider and wider and wider. So it started off the Communist Party, but it included a much wider orbit of organizations and people. So that effectively MI5, really by the mid-1970s, had become a political police force operating alongside the special branch. And the effect of that, in a sense, by prioritizing and devoting basically most of their resources on counter-subversion and political policing, it meant that the counter-espionage stuff was not being done. And the Communist Party, you know, as MI5 itself knew, and as MI5 briefed the government, as MI5 briefed various inquiries, the Communist Party was not an espionage problem, in a sense, and this was accepted widely by those in establishment positions. But nevertheless, the energies and resources went into the Communist Party surveillance and monitoring. And the result of that was that the real problems, in a sense, given that if you see espionage as a problem, and if that is your mandate, there was a massive failure on the part of the security service actually to do their core job, which was basically to deal with the problem of espionage. And in a sense, one of the conclusions that we reach in the book, I think perhaps slightly tongue-in-cheek and perhaps slightly controversial, is that the real threat to national security in this country during the Cold War lay not in the Communist Party, but in the Conservative Party, because it was the Conservative Party governments that allowed foreign agents, if you like, to get close to the very center of the defense establishment, as many of these scandals, in inverted commas, are revealed.
Yeah. In terms of the targets of MI5 in that era, you mentioned the Communist Party, the peace movement, civil liberties organizations, NCCL, Haldane Society of Lawyers, Socialist Lawyers. There's a couple of case studies that have connections with the library and have papers in library collections. Phil Peralton, Communist Party MP, DM Pritt, Labour MP and lawyer. Could you comment on those cases?
Yeah, it was a lot of, the targets were wide ranging. I mean, in a sense, it was Communist Party initially, and the reason that they got justification for that from Attlee, of all people, because when Attlee decided in 1948 that Communist Party membership would exclude people from civil service employment, that then justified the Communist Party in maintaining this fantastic database of Communist Party members. So we've got to, if it is state policy to exclude Communist Party members from certain forms of employment, the security service then needs to know who the Communist Party members are. So this amazing exercise, operation, then took place to find out or to make sure they knew who all these Communist Party members were, but not just members of the party, but also their friends and colleagues, associates, and others who might be, and organizations which might have some link with or to the Communist Party. So that would take you then to some trade unions, trade union officials. It would say, as you said, take you to the British Peace Committee. It would take you to the NCCL, it would take you to the Haldane Society, it would take you to the Labour Research Department, it would take you to groups within the Communist Party, like the Communist Party Lawyers Group, about whom they were desperate to have knowledge and information. But it would also take you to members of parliament, either members of parliament who were party members, and of course there were 2 Communist Party MPs elected in 1945, but also Labour Party members who had sympathies or associations with the Communist Party. And, you know, as you say, a lot of this is documented in the book, but the Phil Paratin case, I think, is an interesting one. Phil Paratin was elected Communist Party member in 1945, along with Willie Gallagher. Gallagher, of course, great figure from West Fife, actually from my part of the world. I was born in his constituency, and he was joined in Parliament. He'd previously been elected, of course, in the 1930s, but he was joined in Parliament in 1945. Harry Pollitt almost made it from South Wales, but he didn't. But Phil Paratin made it from a seat in East London. Now, what is interesting about the Phil Paratin case, I think, it tells us a lot about the surveillance that was going on of not just party members, officials, and others in these other organisations, but this actually striking the very heart of democracy, which it was supposed to be MI5's business to protect. And so what you have in the case of Paratin is, Paratin's file is there. I think there are multiple volumes of it. It's a very, very thick file. And so what you see is that at his election in 1945, his campaign is being monitored. So there's a big file which includes notes of intercepted phone calls about the campaign, special branch reports about election meetings that he'd spoken at, so special branch telling him around the constituency. There's special branch on the file, all his election literature was on the file. There was an MI5 assessment of the campaign. Why did he succeed? Presumably for passing on to others. There was detailed, very granular information about his supporters, those supporters who provided cars, the car registration numbers, information about following up with the car owners to find out who they were, and presumably to keep an eye on them as well. Then when he was elected, in a sense, he was under surveillance as a member of parliament. So he'd be followed, his constituency meetings, he'd be followed at these, there'd be special branch reports on that. When he went to speak outside the constituency, he was trailed down to Devon to speak at a local authority meeting down in Totnes, attended by a detective sergeant from the special branch with his wife and 2 friends, who turned out one cold February night to hear Phil Paratin speak. And it just goes on and on. So, I mean, just the level of surveillance. And it was by virtue of the surveillance of his political activities as an MP that a police officer called Satterthwaite was able to get evidence that Satterthwaite, as a Metropolitan Police Commissioner, a police officer, could then use against Paratin in civil proceedings for slander. This is highly, highly unusual. An MP was sued for slander by a police officer who had been present at the meeting to keep an eye on Paratin, the speaker. And in the end, Paratin was found to have slandered the police officer, substantial damages and costs awarded against him, and he ended up being bankrupted. And as a bankrupt, he couldn't stand the next election. And as a result, his political career came to an end. But that didn't stop his harassment by the police, because after he stopped being a member of parliament, Paratin then went to work for the party on the peace movement and the peace activities of the party in 1950. There was a big conference in Sheffield, the Sheffield Peace Congress, which had been organised, the party active in that. But what is interesting in the file is there is evidence of his phone being tapped. And in order to tap people's phones at that time, you had to get a warrant. At least it was an informal process. I mean, it wasn't legally required, but the practice was that a warrant would be issued by the Home Secretary. So you had to say what the reasons were for the warrants. What would be the justification for putting a tap on Phil Paratin's phone? And I've got here, just in front of me, the reasons for the application. And on the basis of these reasons that the warrant was issued, and simply said the subscriber to the number in question is a long-standing member of the Communist Party in charge at party headquarters of the peace campaign. It is desired to investigate his activities more closely. That was enough. The fact that he was engaged in peace work was sufficient justification for this level of intrusive, intense surveillance. And so that was, in a sense, Paratin, I think, was a good example of an MP being actively watched under close surveillance, and that surveillance actually being used in a hostile way against him to bring him down. I mean, it's a great example of the power of the state to bring down somebody who had been democratically elected by the people of one of the constituencies in East London.
Pritt, of course, was a Labour MP.
Well, Pritt was a different kettle of fish in the sense that Pritt was both an MP and a very active lawyer. And he's an extraordinary figure because he had an international legal practice. So he was often in West Africa. He was scheduled to appear in a case in India. He was asked to represent the defendants in the famous American case before the Supreme Court, a case called Dennis and the US, which led to the conviction of the Communist Party leadership, basically decapitation of the Communist Party in America in 1950. But he was unable to go because of his commitments in India. But Pritt, really from 1941, had been subject to, he'd been elected, I think, around then, either before or just before the war, elected initially as a Labour Party MP, but he was expelled from the Labour Party, I think, in 1941, and then stood in 1945 as independent Labour, and had always had a close relationship with the party. He won in 45 as independent Labour, but he was subject to very, very intensive surveillance by police and by special branch during his time as a member of parliament, as an independent Labour member of parliament. And I think for a number of reasons, one, the fact, of course, his close connections with the Communist Party, desperate to find out what the nature of his relationship with the party was. But also he was, I mean, they were blew hot and cold on suspicions about him being involved in the recruitment of Soviet agents in this country, and the surveillance or the interest in Pritt, I think, stepped up a bit after the Burgess and Maclean departures, and his file was taken out and looked at a bit more closely by MI5. I didn't find anything against him, so in a sense, again, it was in his case, it was a bit of a wasted effort. But there's a lot of interesting stuff in the file about Pritt. And basically, you could write a biography about some of these characters just on the basis of the information stored in their personal files. And I think it probably was a matter of some. He rubbed them in a sense. He was provocative in a sense. He had a country house down at Aldermaston, which everybody knows about Aldermaston. And so basically, this house was on the perimeter of the Aldermaston site. And the name of the cottage was Decoy Cottage. So I imagine that was thought to be quite provocative. And it's quite clear that local coppers had an interest in Pritt, but the local coppers were told to keep away because by MI5, they're basically told just keep away from him because basically, I guess the subtext is we've got this guy under surveillance, under control. And the suspicion is, and I think it's clear enough from the files, but the suspicion is that there had been what are called special facilities, which had been imposed in the Pritt household, or had been imposed, had been introduced or planted, I guess would be a better word, had been planted in the Pritt household. And special facilities is an arrangement which they used in the 1950s At a time when not everybody had a telephone. You've got to think of a very different world. But in the 1950s, I mean, we could get information about you by tapping your phone up at the telephone exchange and basically listening to your telephone calls. But what we could also do, if you're MI5, is that there was a device whereby the telephone itself could be converted into a microphone. And so basically, by this means, you would have a microphone in the house, where so all conversations, not just your telephone conversations, but all conversations in the house could be picked up and were then transcribed and then planted in the file. Now, Andrew, I'm glad to see is back with us. He's a great expert on special facilities. But I'm just saying, Andrew, that we think that the Pritt household at Decoy Cottage was the subject of special facilities, and there's some interesting exchanges which have been transcribed about domestic arrangements, which could only have been picked up either from one of the housekeepers or from special facilities, and we suspect probably the latter.
Yes.
Let's move on to the methods with Andrew and Joan.
Yeah.
Peter Wright famously wrote about burgling and bugging his way across London on behalf of the state. Could you tell us a bit more about the methods used for surveillance?
In terms of microphones, you had, as I think Keith was explaining when I rejoined, you had the special facilities. Strictly speaking, special facilities is that the microphone in the telephone continues to function when it's in the cradle, but they had hidden microphones. And moreover, it was so secret. I mean, it was such political dynamite that even within MI5, they tried to keep the use of hidden microphones secret, and they tried to keep special facilities secret. But even in some of the documents, you've got holes where they actually cut reference to special facilities out with a razor blade, and that's an in-house redaction. Also, particularly if you look at the McLean surveillance, Donald McLean surveillance, you can see where they've taken out all of the documents relating to special facilities. And Donald McLean's house was full of microphones, and they were using special facilities. And the two telephones, including the telephone in the bedroom, to monitor Donald McLean. But they moved all of that material out at a very early stage, probably in the 1950s, into a separate book. It was considered that incendiary, because of course, as Keith may have said, the 50s, 40s and 50s and 60s even were a time when even having a telephone in your house was considered a breach of privacy. So it could actually bring the government down. And that was also closely connected with the shift of ministerial responsibility from the Prime Minister to the Home Secretary. Because it was considered so dangerous, they shifted it over to the Home Secretary, because you might as well have the responsibility all in one place, because of course the Home Secretary was the one who was responsible for Home Office warrants. There is even dispute. Christopher Andrew, MI5's official historian, says there was never a Home Office warrant system relating to microphones. But we present evidence in the book that there was, in fact, a Home Office warrant system. Although what may well have happened, we think, over time, is they were looking at the strict terms of the Attlee Directive. They probably started to take the view that Home Office warrants were only necessary for the telephone-based special facilities and were not necessary for the fixed microphones. But yeah, that was one of the key. Those were the two key differences when it came to intrusive surveillance. It was the fixed microphones and the special facilities. Over and above that, you had the special powers given by virtue of the fact that they've got, 50 years worth of records of monitoring people, particularly communists. And also they had a massive team of watchers, of people who would follow people around London. So those were essentially the special powers that MI5 had. And of course, they also had special power to get people dismissed from their job as well, which should not be overlooked. So MI5, despite supposedly having no more powers than the ordinary citizen, were an extremely powerful organisation. They had a massive archive of files and cards. They had an ability to tap people's phones. They had an ability to listen to people's domestic conversations. They had teams of people to follow people around London, and they could also ensure that people lost their jobs. And it was all based around political policing. And the people that they were after were members of the Communist Party. That was really all. There was a bit of lip service paid to people on the far right, but it was almost completely aimed at communists. It was, as to use Keith's phrase, in many ways it was a displacement activity. It was an awful lot easier to do what they'd been doing for decades, which was to monitor communists going about their business, than it was to actually catch espionage agents. And in many ways, it was perhaps lucky for MI5 that the big enemy that emerged in the aftermath of World War II was the Soviet Union. Had it been another fascist state, they would have found things very, very difficult indeed. But as it is, it worked very well and enabled them to go back to their old activity, of their old default position of monitoring the far left.
They went to remarkable lengths to obtain the party's membership records.
Yeah, a reference there, I think, to Party Peace, which was again another instance where hidden microphones in special facilities and perhaps breaking an entry worked very well for MI5. When it happened over a long period of years, they discovered that MI5's that the Communist Party's membership records were not kept at King Street, but they were kept in a very posh private house, first of all at Regent's Park, and later in Northwest 5, sort of Kentish town, Camden Town, a very posh part of Camden Town. And they pulled out all the stops there in terms of intrusive surveillance, and even to the extent of apparently installing an MI5 officer in a flat in the house in order to let the officers in order to take the files and take them back to MI5 headquarters and photograph them. But quite whether it was some, I think it quite possibly could have been somebody living in the house, because early on in MI5's campaign against the Berger family, they were very surprised to discover that despite the fact they were very rich, they also had lodgers, which surprised them the first time that they were going to burgle the place. But I think it is likely that MI5 had an officer either in a flat in a house or in another. There was another dwelling at their garden that they let out, and it's possible that the MI5 officer may have been down there. But an interesting aside to all of that is that Peter Wright mixed up which target had the Communist Party files in the house. He confused. I think that his book, his brilliant book, MI5 condemned it as being boring, irrelevant, bitter. But it was a fantastically good book, fantastically accurate book, and in a way, Peter Wright's mixing up of Reuben Fulber with Roland Berger is quite understandable. I mean, I constantly get the two mixed up. Roland Berger, Reuben Fulber, they're easily mixed up. And in his book, he confuses the two, which in many ways makes his book far more convincing, really, rather than sort of the accurate kind of story that you get from Christopher Andrew going through the files.
Can I just add to that Operation Party piece? I mean, it was it's a great topical or contemporary interest, because I mean, it was an early example, I think, of the security services actually embedding an officer in a family home or close to a family home. So in a sense, an MI5 officer as a tenant of the Berger family. And also the use of multiple forms of surveillance. So by telephone tapping, they were able to find out where the key was kept, under the mats or wherever. And by getting the key, they were then able to get a copy of the key and to return the original. And the, in a sense, the file suggests where the copy of the key was kept in MI5 HQ. And then to get into the house, they were able to find out when the Bergers would be away on their summer holiday in September. When they knew they were away on holiday, that allowed them to get into the house and this is incredible, to remove 48,000 documents overnight, to copy them in days, remember, before modern photocopiers, to take them to a location to be copied and then to be returned to the house. So when the Bergers came home, they had no knowledge or no idea that they had been burgled, the property had been removed and restored during the period of their absence. And utterly extraordinary. So this would be about the mid-1950s when this was going on. So in a sense, if you think that things that are happening today seem unbelievable, they're probably, in a sense, you've got to maybe just stop and think, well, maybe are they unbelievable? Because you're looking back 60 years, some of the things that were going on 60 years ago must have seemed utterly beyond possibility, but they were happening.
Yeah, and I'd also say that that Party Peace was the climax, really, of a few years of operations and a few years of straightforward burglaries. There are some very evocative photographs of Communist Party membership records that were clearly taken at night in some of the early burglaries when they broke in and photographed them in situ. They're great files to see. It was that they got thousands of membership documents in previous years, but Party Peace was the big job where they got the rest of them. I mean, it was a great time, which is why it's I think which is why such a shameful episode really is such a big feature of Christopher Andrews' book. You know, I think they regarded it as a massive crime. And it, although having said that, if you look at a lot of the records of official cabinet committees and of MI5 speaking to those committees, they did have, before 1955 and Party Peace, they did have a really good picture of how many members of the party there were in the country. Not surprisingly, really, because of the level of surveillance. I mean, they had all sorts of figures when it came down to extraordinarily precise figures when it came down to university teachers who were members of the Communist Party or fellow travellers, or people in the General Post Office who were communists. Something like 40, bizarre figures, you know, like 14,000 something postmen. And they weren't too far off either with their early estimates of party membership, which I think were 35,000 members and 3,000 young Communist League members. Oh, and plus 150,000 Communist Party sympathisers. And they reckoned at that time, just prior to Party Peace, that they had files on 250,000 people who had had some kind of connection with the Communist Party, a connection sufficient for them to be carded or for a file to have been opened on them. Which was, I mean, it's as we've probably said before, and as has probably been said earlier in this launch, it was Stasi level. If you remember the Communist Party, it was Stasi level surveillance. I mean, it's extraordinary in retrospect. And also at a time, and this has probably been mentioned before, there they were running around looking at all of these communists. At the time, the Communist Party eschewed espionage. They were deeply unhappy that Dave Springall had done his spying. They were deeply embarrassed by Percy Gladden. And yet, MI5 was still targeting the Communist Party. And yet, Guy Liddell, who is one of the primary sources of the book, his closest friends were Soviet agents. Anthony Blunt, Guy Burgess, Tim Philby, people he went to lunch with regularly. he tried to get Guy Burgess into MI5, and he said of Guy Burgess, I can't see Guy as being the sort of person who would sell his country's secrets. A complete misjudgment. One of the most famous spies in the 20th century.
One of the things that struck me about it was just all that stuff was just the complete futility of it.
Yes,
and,
yes.
Yeah, so you get all the, you look at Harry Pollock's file. I mean, it's a mountainous series of volumes. And that'd be true of a lot of the files. You think it's just a collection of material just for the sake of it. It was just, what good is this? I mean, what use could it ever be put to? Just collecting information for the sake of collecting information. And it's kind of, the other point actually was they got so much information, they didn't know what they had. And there was a great, I found to be a great example of this was a situation involving John Bowden, who was in the 60s, was well known. He's a lawyer, but well known as a party member, party activist. He would have been insulted, I think, by information that had been relayed from London to the embassy in Greece in 1968, that he had no Communist Party connections. So he had gone out to Greece in 1968 at the time of the Colonels with the Haldane Society to do an investigation. The Haldane Society deputation had asked for normal consular or embassy facilities and courtesies to be extended to them. So the embassy gets back to London, basically do a check on these people, because of course Haldane Society, they were deeply suspicious. So if information comes back, Bowden has basically he's not known to us as a Communist Party member. Well, absolutely ridiculous, because we come across him in our work as having been, as party member, but he was well known, publicly as being a party member. So in a sense, here you have, if you want evidence of the abject futility of this process, here you have information about, a well-known party member, on whom I think he had a personal file number, on whom it seems that whoever was doing the checking back at MI5 HQ had no knowledge of the existence of this character. I mean, utterly ridiculous. So, but it's, as I say, it's collecting information for the sake of collecting information.
Can I just bring Joan in on the human consequences of the MI5 abuses of power, particularly in the civil service, with the blacklisting, vetting and purging regime?
Well, my favorite story, I think, about the purge, and the book lays out the details of when it occurred and the two, when we had negative vetting and then positive vetting. But I was reminded of the story when Keith was talking and Andrew about having missed the spies practicing in our midst. I always wondered if that was, well, and Andrew said they were having lunch together, if there was some class basis for letting these, spies continue in their work. But there was a young woman who worked in the cafeteria at GCHQ who was fired because her partner was a member of the Communist Party. And they were afraid that if people going through the cafeteria line were chatting about confidential information, she would pick it up and pass it on. So Burgess, Philby, and McLean went madly, spying. And this young woman got fired as a cashier at the cafeteria. That's the kind of, the stories, and a lot of those personal stories, in fact, are in the NCCL archives, where people wrote and said, I've lost my job, or I'm afraid I'm going to lose my job. And it was very sad. They were people who had, lower level careers and were not in any way spies. Some of them weren't, as this young woman wasn't even a member of the party, but her partner was.
Can I just interrupt there, please, Joan?
Yeah.
And this seems to be a kind of consistent feature of them drifting away from the real targets and drifting back to get the soft targets. This happened with the industrial purge. It was supposed to be technicians and managers who were to be purged. but they were too difficult because they were likely to write to their MP or write to the papers. It was far easier to get rid of the blue collar staff who were associated with the Communist Party, although they weren't the targets because they didn't have an opportunity to see any secrets. But inevitably they drifted back to targeting the blue collar workers because it was easier. And because it was, and as Keith has said before, this displacement activity. They couldn't actually deal with the real thing, so they drifted back to dealing with placebos, on Sally targets. It's absurd. Yeah. I love the story of the waitress at DCHQ. Yeah.
And also the case that John found that the NCCL files, the woman at the Liverpool Echo. So she got sacked because she'd been to a British Peace Committee meeting. The British Peace Committee at the time was under suspicion because it was said to have been either infiltrated or dominated by the Communist Party. So in a sense, she was gone.
Right.
Lots of stories like that involve a lot of, as Andrew says, involving industrial workers working for companies that had government contracts. The massive surveillance,
serious lack of safeguards and rights for civil servants caught up in this, wasn't there?
Say that again, sorry.
Limited rights.
Yeah, very limited rights. I mean, basically they had no rights at the time because civil servants were employed at will. They could be dismissed at the pleasure of the Crown, so they had no protection whatsoever. And so they didn't even have basic common law rights in relation to wrongful dismissal. I mean, they could be dismissed at a moment's notice.
If I just may interrupt for a second, Keith, but there was an awful lot of stuff which was written that didn't actually make the book. Reading things in the last few days, it's reminded me of some of that stuff. But one was the unpurgables. They had the problem of some people that knew so much that they just couldn't purge them. Because if they did, they would have disgruntled people leaving GCHQ or wherever it would be, likely to do something or to say something about what was going on at GCHQ. There was some stuff that Keith picked up, I remember, from the files, which is really indicative of Cabinet Secretary Norman Brooks' increasing role in relation to security. But Norman Brooke, and I think the Home Secretary, advised, I think it was Egan, that the first parts of the first Radcliffe report relating to GCHQ should not be circulated amongst the Cabinet because it was too secret. They shouldn't be they shouldn't be revealed to Cabinet ministers. But on top of that, they also said that it was almost certain that the Russians knew all about GCHQ, so it didn't matter anyway. So it was all bonkers. It really was.
Well, that's a good story actually, because they wanted to ban trade unions from GCHQ as early as 1956. So it wasn't until 1985 that the ban was actually introduced, but they wanted to ban them in 1956, but they couldn't circulate the proposal to do this to the Cabinet because members of the Cabinet did not at that time know about the existence of GCHQ. But the explanation was, well, but the Russians do, so what's the point in taking this step? And the reason why we don't want to make it public is because it will so offend the Americans if the Americans get to know that we still have trade unions at GCHQ. And so, I mean, it's just for the most, as Andrew said, for those bonkers reasons that decisions were taken.
Well,
the fact that in 1956, members of the British Cabinet did not know that GCHQ existed. And that was a reason for not circulating documents to members of the Cabinet.
But the concern about what the Americans would think was common. It was discussed. There was a case, and I'm blocking his name now. He was a college professor who had left the United States without a passport, one of many people, because he was about to be called up in front of one of the investigating committees. And he was here and he had a residence permit and he was teaching, and the government decided to lift his visa. And he appealed it, and there were a lot of people who were on his side, and his name will come to me, obviously, when I'm done talking. And there was a cabinet meeting where someone who, you know, fairly prominent had supported him, and they said, well, we can't possibly let him stay, because if we do, we will be acknowledging that the United States, you know, is persecuting people for their politics. And we can't let anybody think that we actually believe that. So they kicked him out. He went to Czechoslovakia. And then later there was a lawyer in the US, one of the prominent left-wing lawyers, who got everybody back in who had left without passports. And he was one of the people. But it was just blatant. And I'm wondering whether some of even the, you know, collection of information was to keep the Americans happy.
I think a lot of decisions were taken not to offend them, certainly. And a lot of
not out of time.
Yeah.
So we've had a question about whether or not you came across any references to the Connolly Association being a target.
Yeah, I came across, we've got two references to, I mean, Connolly is one of my great political hero. There are two, when I found a reference to Connolly, I couldn't avoid using it, but Connolly came up. There's one file that we use, a guy called Bert Edwards, who was a very unusual file. It's very unusual to come across a file. It's Andrew who found this, to come across a file of an active trade unionist who basically was he wasn't a senior official in the movement by any manner of means. But anyway, it's quite an interesting. It's a very interesting file. But in the course of the file, there is a reference to him as being the son-in-law of James Connolly. And what struck me about that was that not much was made of that. I mean, I'd have thought that would have been dynamite, but it was just a passing reference. But there was another case in the Pritt file where Pritt was acting on behalf of the Connolly Association, I think, in relation to litigation. Maybe it was a defamation case in Dublin that he was involved in. And so there was some monitoring of picking up, certainly in Pritt's file, picking up of this activity in relation to the Connolly Association. I haven't actually looked to see whether, or I don't think collectively we've looked to see whether there is a file specifically on the Connolly Association, but that would be quite good. I wouldn't mind actually following that up. So I'd be interested to see if there is. So thank you. There may be reasons actually why, if there are files on the Connolly Association, why they're not actually released, and that would go, you know, I'm beginning to think now that because of the troubles and the current issues in relation to Ireland, that all sensitive Irish stuff will not be in the public domain, and there may not even be any formal recognition. But you know, the Connolly Association was active in this country after 1945. It seems to me to be inconceivable that there would not be some level of surveillance of its activities.
We've also been asked, given your knowledge of the of past state abuses, what's your views on the dangers posed by the Covert Human Intelligence Sources Bill?
Well, I think Andrew's just written a blog on this, so over to you.
Simply because it's, I mean, it is certainly the case that, as was suggested, I think, by Keir Starmer, that these things go on anyway. We did sort of make a kind of bit of a miserable excuse for the official Labour approach to the bill, that these things were going to go ahead anyway. So, you know, there's no point in troubling too much over it. But it's simply the case that what was previously normal practice has now been encouraged. It was accepted that MI5 and special branch officers would infiltrate or would ask informers to act as agents provocateurs. But now it's been given the green light, the official thumbs up. So really, it's an extraordinary episode. I mean, when I first started to read the bill, I could scarcely believe that they were were actually giving immunity. That they were actually saying that, and this is how it will go through. It will be the case that these criminal acts will no longer be criminal acts. Previously, the position was that because these criminal acts were going down, or people who were engaging in criminal acts were going down on a register, and they could be produced by MI5 or by special branch if things went wrong and they were caught, in order to try to persuade the director of public prosecutions that would not be in the public interest. Now, it doesn't, it's not a matter of persuading the DPP or the ordinary police that a prosecution would not be in public interest. It's done and dusted. They can do what they want. It does beg a belief. And it's particularly surprising with the leader of the Labour Party, given his role as prosecutor for so long, that he's given the thumbs up. I mean, it's all you would expect of the Johnson government. I mean, you know, it's what bears do in the woods. But of the Labour Party, I was very, very surprised. They did try to make some sensible amendments to the bill, but it's almost certainly going to go through pretty much intact, I think. And it's something of tragedy. Can I just say, I know we're getting close to the end, but sort of closely related to this, it was interesting in relation to knitting that the designated lawyer for the policeman in this, they've been sort of lashing out a bit towards MI5 and saying MI5 was involved in this. They've been saying we weren't a delinquent part of special branch because MI5 contributed to these operations and received all of our information. And the lawyer was saying, contrary to the official history of MI5 by Christopher Andrew, the net was cast much wider by MI5, that they were going much further than they admitted to in the official history, going for all manner of left-wing organisations. They didn't mention trade unions, or at least they haven't at this stage. But it's only sort of 1968 to 1972 that they're talking about at the moment. But they did mention all manner of left-wing organisations that MI5 hadn't owned up to monitoring previously. But it's very interesting to see members of the security service throwing accusations at each other. I mean, some of the documents, the documents that have been released are generally very, very disappointing. But there was one that was released, I think, on the 19th of November, which was essentially saying that MI5's F2, which which at that time would have been the industrial desk, had paid for some operation, special demonstration squad operation. Quite what the operation is, we don't know. But as it was F2, which incorporated the industrial desk of MI5, it's possible that it could have been operations against trade unions.
But in the material we were looking at, I mean, the files that we've been looking at, the stuff full, MI5 files in the KV series, MI5 files are stuffed full of special branch reports.
Yes, stuffed full of special branch reports, and a Home Office, massive Home Office file we had is stuffed full of special branch reports about trade union meetings.
Yeah.
The extent of special branch and MI5 surveillance of trade unions was massive. There's no doubt about it. And looking at the file numbers, in the stuff released to Mitten, they've been careful enough to remove the file numbers. In the stuff in the Home Office files, there's the file numbers still remain. So I won't bore you with the numbers, but they're very large numbers. And you've got sort of cross-references to, for example, the London gas strike in 1950. And in that will say, in another file, and there'll be another file with a number that's quite close, but, you know, perhaps 75 numbers out. And then there'll be a reference to another file, but indicating that there's a broad spectrum of hundreds and hundreds of files. And those were files based on special branch information stored by F3, and F3 with the industrial policing section of the Home Office, who were able to tell special branch to jump, and special branch would jump. And they were still active at the time of the miners' strike. I don't know if they're active now. They're probably just under another name. It's rather like special branch hasn't existed since 2006. But of course, you know, what we regard as special branch has always existed and continues to exist, because special branch MI5 used to cultivate the ordinary police in the provincial forces and encourage them to have a couple of officers to do what they called special branch work, which was essentially to report on the Communist Party. So, you know, the concept of special branch is a loose one. It doesn't have to be Metropolitan Police Special Branch. It's just the political police force. And the fact that it doesn't actually exist any longer is really quite irrelevant, because the ordinary police at the local station in Cambridge, they will perform special branch work and report to MI5, just as the Metropolitan Special Branch will. Anyway, I've probably been going on too long.
Yeah, there's a couple more points in the chat. One references surveillance of the university historians. Of course, that's a chapter in the book, a section in the book about the surveillance on campuses. A question: did your research uncover any leading people in the movement working for MI5? And finally, from Ruth, she asks, is a more affordable version of the book coming out? Is there going to be a paperback version, because the cost is prohibitive, £80 being an academic text? If you could just wrap up on those questions, please.
What we've tried to do is wherever, in terms of people in the movement who are snitches, you would expect that they would go to great lengths to redact that information to stop it getting into the public domain. But there are sometimes, I think, mistakes that are made, and there is correspondence that is sometimes included in files. I think sometimes unwittingly, sometimes not in MI5 files, but sometimes in maybe files from the Lord Chancellor's Department or wherever. Where these have been available, we have always referred to the individuals in question. So in a sense, where it's been possible to do so, we've always tried to provide a public service in identifying who the sources are, to the extent that that has been possible. So there are a few people who do appear. Whether or not, well, yes, so there's a guy who used to go to holiday meetings, for example, who wrote and complained to his MP about Jack Gaster. So in a sense, that's there. There are a few other examples of that. In terms of the price of the book, I agree. I mean, it's shocking. But what I would ask, maybe you could order it for your local library, if you live in a place where there's still a library. Maybe you could order it for a local library, and that would be, since then more people could get access to it. I don't know about paperback at this stage. There is going to be an audio book. I don't know how much audio books cost, but I don't imagine it'd be great bedtime reading. But there is going to be an audio book. I don't know when that's coming out.
Thanks, Keith. We're now over time, so I'll hand back to Marge.
Okay. Well, thank you ever so much. I think that has been absolutely amazing. Thank you, Kevin, very much. And thank you ever so much to our three speakers. I think we just end by saying, yeah, do get your library to buy the book. And if you're not already a member of Mark's Memorial Library, please do join up. And say very many thanks again to you all. And thanks to Alex for managing the technology so effectively. Okay, so good night and thank you.
Thank you, Marge. Thank you. Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.